The graphics of today's PlayStation games blow our minds as gamers, but they weren't always like that, so today Gameranx would like to take you on a little trip through the evolution of PlayStation graphics. Back in 1995, I was a child. A lot of you whippersnappers don't realize this, but games used to have color palettes. 8 and 16-bit ones to be exact. You could only use certain colors, and a certain amount of them. Can you imagine how my dumb kid brain reacted when it first saw Rayman in 1995? It was something like this. Whoa! It was the 90s, remember. It was totally okay to make sounds like that back then. Now, I didn't comprehend the idea of the limitations of color palettes until much later in my life, but I didn't know I'd never seen anything like that, and I was like, what? Obviously, this piqued my curiosity, and not much later I saw another game from 95, Wipeout. Now, I'd played Mario Kart and Star Fox, and I thought, cool, 3D games. I'm going forward instead of sideways. But Wipeout is something completely different than that. Wipeout opens your eyes to what's possible. If you were exclusively a console gamer, you hadn't seen anything like this. Environments were not flat, objects took up space, everything felt like it had momentum. There was just a different quality to it than what we had ever seen before as far as attempts at what looked like 3D. But what really established the PlayStation as a dominant force in 3D gaming was 1996's Tomb Raider. Tomb Raider's visuals were controversial for two large reasons that we won't be speaking about. What's really worth pointing out in Tomb Raider is that it kind of gave us a cinematic base that other games really hadn't. Massive action-packed set pieces didn't exist prior to Tomb Raider. Do you think Uncharted would have happened if Tomb Raider hadn't? Also, while third-person games existed prior to Tomb Raider, nothing really felt as fluid, especially on the 32-bit PlayStation. Also, the more realistic adult-themed graphics started a trend that we are still following today. In the mid-90s, fighting games were a big thing. 1997 brought us the best-looking 3D fighter to date, and that was Tekken 3. People were constantly throwing around hot takes on whether 2D or 3D was better in fighting games, and 3D was still fairly new, and people were just kind of like, I don't know. At least with fighting games. With everything else, people had decided everything has to be 3D at this point, but Tekken 3 kind of shut everybody up. The detail in Tekken 3's character models impressed a lot of people, and frankly, the graphics in Tekken 3 wiped the floor with basically everything else released that year. A lot of the things that Tomb Raider started in 1996, Metal Gear Solid built upon in 1998. They're not the same kind of game, but the graphical themes are definitely apparent. Much more cinematic, darker, less saturated in color, and going for a more realistic and gritty look. Metal Gear Solid took it a step further and played a lot with more artistic camera angles. You really felt as though you were smack dab in the middle of an espionage operation, and this was in no small part due to the incredibly advanced graphics of the title. An underrated gem of the time was 1999's Vanark. Vanark was a title very much in the vein of Star Fox 64 or Panzer Dragoon. It was an on-rail shooter that frankly not too many people played, but it was smooth and it was fun, and it had some pretty detailed ship models as well as some cool lighting effects and some other stuff that you didn't really see on PlayStation. It was a time when competition was very fierce and frontiers were very new. All the consoles kind of needed their entry to specific genres as well as a reason that theirs stood out. Vanark was a pretty solid title in both those respects, and actually just one of the better looking PlayStation titles, period. Were you JRPG fans feeling left out? Well, no more, because 1999 produced one of the best looking PlayStation games in Chrono Cross. I know you're probably thinking, but what about 1997? What happened there? Square was just getting warmed up as far as 3D goes with Final Fantasy VII. And Chrono Cross is art. I'm not trying to start an argument, but let's be realistic. Compare Final Fantasy VII to Tekken 3 or Metal Gear Solid. It was certainly progression, but was it at the top? Chrono Cross absolutely, positively was. And honestly, where would we be talking about PlayStation graphics if we weren't including 1999's Gran Turismo 2? Gran Turismo has become very much a tradition for incredible graphics, and you can follow most of that back to Gran Turismo 2 when you started to see some pretty cool things like reflections on the cars. They shined like real vehicles. That gave it an edge even when comparing it to the Nintendo 64 racing titles. The series established itself as more of a simulation style racing game than arcade, and it's not just the controls that we're talking about when we say that. Gran Turismo 2 was a gorgeous racing game for the time. Another gorgeous racing game from the same year, 1999's Wipeout 3. Wipeout 3 was among the first games that really supported widescreen. It's a massive improvement over the first game's graphics, as you can see right here. Wipeout 3 happily competed with 64-bit graphics. I mean, in all honesty, have a look at this. In all seriousness, you could possibly misinterpret this footage as simply a PSN game with a retro look. Everything from the ship models to the tracks to the HUD puts Wipeout 3 kind of in a class of its own. And as we come to a close the PlayStation era, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention 2000's Vagrant Story. Vagrant Story is another really pretty game from Squaresoft. However, this one did not get the kind of publicity their mainline titles did, as it basically was a new IP, which is a little bit of a strange thing to do at the very end of a console generation. But at the time, they were a little more prone to taking risks than they are today, and it resulted in a very unique and very pretty title to close out the generation. In the year 2000, PlayStation 2 hit the world very hard, and Dead or Alive 2 hit the world pretty hardcore as well. In the year 2000, Dead or Alive 2 had the most detailed character models. Some people considered some of the characters to be a little bit too detailed, as a matter of fact. Still, the controversy it generated with some things in it can't negate the advances in technology that this game showed that we'd finally got. Really, look at that compared to Tekken 3, probably the best looking fighting game of the previous generation. It's no contest. In 2001, Final Fantasy X came out. Some consider it genre-defining and some consider it a prominent series swan song. My personal opinion, little of column A, little of column B. Final Fantasy X would essentially establish the style that Square would use as a blueprint for all future Final Fantasy titles. Some people say you can trace that back to Final Fantasy VIII, but I would have to disagree. It was evidence of where they were going, but look at Final Fantasy X and try to tell me that 13 looks really that much different. Oh sure, there's more detail, but this is the year 2001 we're talking here. I mean, this shit's incredible. The same year, Hideo Kojima decided that he wanted to be on the forefront of everything at all times. 2001's Metal Gear Solid 2 holds up today. I mean, that's how incredible this game looks. The HD remake is really just a resolution upscale. Is it as hyper-realistic as the titles of today? No, but it is a stylistic masterpiece. Be honest, the polygon counts for the year 2001 in this game are absolutely off the charts, right? Expressions, weather, effects, way ahead of its time. In the year 2002, Kingdom Hearts came out. It was a little bit different as far as the concept, and took a more colorful and simplistic approach to graphics. But don't be fooled, in its simplicity, it was a very detailed and very interesting looking game. The strength of Kingdom Hearts graphics very much lies in the strength of both Square and Disney. At this point in time, masters of their specific medium. That collaboration created one of the most unique and pretty games to have ever existed, and reminded people that games don't have to be the most realistic thing to be beautiful. In 2002, Grand Theft Auto Vice City came out. Not the first 3D Grand Theft Auto, but the first one that showed Rockstar Games was really serious about creating something that looked amazing. The game took everything that Grand Theft Auto 3 did and thought, what if we made it a little bit more artful? The weather and the lighting effects alone set this game apart from many other games in the era. They cleverly used the 80s aesthetic as it allowed them to do some things that didn't necessarily require perfection. Neon lights basically afford you the ability to do anything if you really think about it. And the architecture in 80s Miami doesn't really require a lot of polygons or textures, which allowed them to put more detail into things that you were concentrating on. 2003's Final Fantasy X-2 wasn't necessarily the best game of all time. I'm not saying it's bad and it's awesome that they went ahead and did something with some female empowerment. However, they could have done better. But everything they did right about the graphics in Final Fantasy X, they enhanced in Final Fantasy X-2. I mean, are you watching the effects that are going on here? This is something that we didn't really see before this. But sometimes that's also where art has to come from. People have to think outside of the box. And Square definitely did for Final Fantasy X-2. 2003 saw Need for Speed establish itself as a frontrunner in graphics with Need for Speed Underground. NFS had never really been ahead of the pack. The graphics were always pretty good in the series, but with Underground it really just sort of swept everything else away. Also sweeping everything else away that year was Madden 2004, which obviously the games always came out a year early. I know it feels weird, but the 1994 Toyota Tercel came out in 1993, so just go with it, alright? Sports games often put themselves at the forefront of graphics by taking advantage of the fact that you're looking at a bunch of people on a big rectangle. This allows them to focus specifically on what a human looks like and how a human moves. This is the year that Madden really started to shine and show everybody exactly what they can do. Speaking of a tour de force, 2004's Grand Theft Auto San Andreas said to everybody, you know what? Open world is gonna mean open. And yeah, Vice City was pretty, but San Andreas was huge and prettier. To have increased the scale this much, as well as improved the quality of the graphics this much, I mean, think of everything they had to have going at once in order to accomplish Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. The world was huge, and they were rendering a large portion of it at all times. The characters were a lot more detailed as well. And while the world of San Andreas was incredibly detailed, 2005's Need for Speed Most Wanted brought a focused, extreme level of detail to the cars and closed-off tracks. It's important when you're talking about graphics not to compare an open-world game with a game where they don't have to create every single detail in every single area. But just for fun, let's say Most Wanted's graphics pretty much shit on everything else that year, at least for cars and cities. And that's really hard to do because we're very used to seeing all this stuff. And frankly, the game was a pretty close reproduction, but that's not always what developers are trying to go for with graphics. The same year, Shadow of the Colossus came out for PlayStation 2, and it was really a beautiful game, and every bit as unrealistic as it was beautiful. When people talk about games as art, they often bring up Shadow of the Colossus, and it's easy to see why. It's not just beautiful, it's also very different in its goals as to what it wants to accomplish with its graphics. Though it has a limited color palette, it intends to evoke emotion and provide you with a fantasy setting unlike something you've ever seen before, which is an idea that 2006's Okami decided to expound upon a great deal. You'll often see trends appear when you follow many years in gaming, but a game like Okami can only happen when several factors come together. Visually, Okami bucked basically every trend going on. One might even call it a reaction to something like Shadow of the Colossus. The two games do a great job accomplishing the same things, providing you with a fantastic setting that you've never seen before. It definitely drew a lot of inspiration from Wind Waker, but it was beautiful. In 2006, the PlayStation 3 came out, and in 2007, it started whooping ass. Whose ass? Basically anybody who starts a war nowadays. Call of Duty Modern Warfare was a big deal, not just in that it was a major franchise continuing on a new generation, but graphically it was a massive increase over most things that we'd ever played before. In my opinion, the realism versus stylization debate is a dumb one. Frankly, there's room for both. But in 2007, Modern Warfare was basically the most realistic thing anybody had ever seen on a console. And DICE said, oh sure, you can do that. And then in 2008, they created Mirror's Edge, which is an incredibly stylized, gorgeous, first-person free-running game, which does not sound like an intuitive idea at all, and offers several graphical hurdles like what happens when you flip. In fact, all of these beautiful people, animations, and environments could have gone to waste if they had not truly mastered the ideas that they had come up with, as far as animation. In the end, Mirror's Edge not only progresses the idea of artistic game making, but it also doesn't make you puke at any time. In 2009, the second in the Uncharted series came out. Among Thieves was a very big deal in terms of graphics, in a way that even the first one wasn't. The increased use of motion capture was very apparent from the get-go, but Naughty Dog went a step further and created an HDR lighting process that involves quite a few different algorithms, including ambient occlusion, among other things. Now, there's not going to be a pop quiz, you don't need to know what that means, but I think we can all agree that game looks incredible and is one of the most cinematic game experiences available, which opened the floodgates. In 2010, God of War 3 exploded onto the scene. With that same cinematic goal in mind, God of War 3 takes us into extreme fantasy territory, dealing with various mythologies, combining that with a brutality something like Uncharted really wouldn't include, as it really isn't part of the MO. The extreme nature of the content and gameplay is only complemented by the extreme detail in the graphics. This is a game where everything has a texture, everything has a feel. When something's wet, it looks wet, and when something hurts, it's a beautiful game. The following year, the exact opposite came out. Journey is a bright, wide-open antithesis of Arkham Asylum. However, the craft of illustrative game making is arguably on display in this title more than it is in almost any other. When you talk about Journey, you don't really need to talk about polygon counts or effect. You don't really need to talk about stylized versus realism. You kinda just go, wow, someone did this. I mean, there is nothing else like Journey. Journey is a unique game, more so in its rich visuals than in any other way. In 2012, Assassin's Creed 3 redefined so much of its own self. It was a good time for a massive upgrade in the graphics. With the new console generation looming, much better looking games were going to be advertised on a more regular basis. Assassin's Creed is Ubisoft's flagship title, and it has to look as good as it possibly can relevant at all times, so they really pushed the limits of the PlayStation 3. There are some mind-blowing sequences in this game, and it's stuff that you can't really find anywhere else. That's the kind of thing that wins the argument which game has better graphics. In 2013, there wasn't an argument, though. The Last of Us had the best graphics. Period. Naughty Dog had pushed themselves so far. With the Uncharted series, they really just felt like they had to, top it. We can talk polygons and mocap all day. Honestly, I don't want to. The atmosphere is what really makes this game. It also really made BioShock Infinite in 2013. A very distinct visual style, plus a very distinct location, make this game one of the first to really start undoing our preconceived notions of what a 3D game can do. If you think about it, there was actually a really long period of time where we were really sure we had gotten there. Our perceptions are really one of the things that limit us more than anything else. And BioShock Infinite showed us that there are more visual mountains to climb. The current gen. 2014 brought us Dragon Age Inquisition. High fantasy meets high technology. When you move to a new console generation and you say, I want a game full of magic, and I really want it to look like next generation stuff, you do what BioWare did, and you go nutso. Frankly, Dragon Age Inquisition sometimes looks like a tech demo, it looks so good. Almost every single scene has some kind of effect that wasn't possible in previous generation of hardware. You can lose track of how many new things you see in this game, just like you can lose track of exactly how many colors are in infamous Second Son. A decidedly gritty game, Second Son goes out of its way not to be that kind of gritty. Reds, yellows, blues, it's all there. And a wide palette does nothing but emphasize the amazing effects in this game. Every ball of fire, every explosion, every single minute change in temperature feels like art. The particle effects in this game are amazing. It really all comes together into tour de force of the new PlayStation hardware. Say what you want about Destiny, but 2014 was the year of the gorgeous game. Destiny brings you a completely different outlook on what Bungie can do, particularly visually. Not to make such a big deal about colors, but there's so many in this game, and they're used to such an atmospheric effect. It's really amazing. You could take a picture of basically anything in Destiny and send it as a postcard. You might look like a little bit of a weirdo, but yeah, you could. And people would be like, this is pretty. My friend is a weirdo, but it's pretty. A lot of people will probably have a lot to say about The Order 1886, but can we at least agree that this is one amazing looking game? Now, I like to go on about color depth and how many colors are in it, and frankly, there's not a lot in The Order 1886. But something that can make up for a narrow color palette is an incredibly good usage of a narrow color palette. Wow, does The Order 1886 manage that one. Even better, when there are short flourishes of other colors that you don't typically see, it really creates an emphasis. A game that did actually have a little bit of controversy about how it looked was The Witcher 3: The Wild Hunt. A lot of people weren't particularly happy with how the blades of grass look. If video games look that good that that's the thing you complain about, it might just be time to reevaluate exactly what it is that you care about. The Witcher 3: Wild Hunt is one of the best looking games of all time. And it's an open world game. The attention to detail paid for an entire world is insane. I'm super psyched to be where we are on the PlayStation 4. But I'm even more excited for where we're going in 2016. Uncharted 4 is going to beat every other game we've talked about. It's going to be the biggest deal in video game graphics I can even remember. There's going to be times when you're like, is this an action movie or am I playing a game? It's not even done yet, and what we've seen completed is just beyond. And that's the best word you can use to describe it. Beyond. And we know that that is the game running on a PlayStation 4 because it's screwed up. Like, that shit was real. Speaking of real, if you thought our video was, go ahead and click that like button and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Come back daily to Gameranx. We upload tons of great stuff. I promise you, you won't be disappointed. I mean, unless you really like bad things, then you will be disappointed. Anyway, thanks for watching, and we will see you next time.